My gold digger ex laughed at my old Honda. She had no idea I owned the company that was about to fire her new boyfriend. She laughed so hard, she had to grab the valet stand to stay upright. Oh my God, Daniel, you still drive this? I didn't answer. I just handed my keys to the valet and watched her face. The same face I used to memorize every morning. Twist into something I hadn't seen in 3 years. Not affection, not even contempt. Pity. She thought she was looking at a man who'd gone nowhere. She had no idea she was standing 4 floors below the office where, in 6 hours, I was going to sign the paperwork that would make her new boyfriend unemployed. Some nights don't start the way you expect them to. They start ordinary. A dinner reservation, a jacket you almost didn't wear, a car you almost didn't drive. And then, without warning, they turn into the night you replay for the rest of your life. This was one of those nights. I hadn't planned on running into Vanessa. I hadn't planned on a lot of things. Actually, 3 years ago, I hadn't planned on coming home early from a work trip to find her closet half empty and a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I need someone who can actually take care of me. I'm sorry." 7 words. That's what 2 years of my life were worth to her. I remember standing in that kitchen so long the ice in my untouched glass of water melted completely. I remember not being angry. That came later. What I remember first was a silence. The specific, ringing silence of an apartment that used to have someone else's breathing in it. People love to tell you that heartbreak makes you weaker. They're wrong. Heartbreak, if you let it, is the sharpest tool you'll ever be handed. Most people cut themselves with it. A few of us learn to carve something with it instead. I spent the next 8 months doing something Vanessa never would have predicted. I got quiet. I stopped posting. I stopped explaining myself to anyone at family dinners who asked, with that particular blend of concern and hunger, "So, what happened with you two?" I let them believe I'd fallen apart. Let me be clear about something, because this story isn't going to make sense unless you understand it. I did fall apart. For a while. Grief doesn't care how disciplined you think you are. There were nights I sat on the floor of that same kitchen and stared at the space where her shoes used to be, feeling something so hollow it had a temperature. But somewhere around month 4, the grief started to curdle into something else. Something colder. Something with a plan. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it matters later. The plan started before the money did. Vanessa didn't leave because I was poor. I want to correct that misconception right now, because it's the lie she told everyone, including, I guess, herself. I wasn't poor. I was unfinished. At the time she left, I was 2 years into building a small logistics software company with my college roommate, Marcus. We had 11 employees, a leaky office above a dry cleaner, and a product that, on paper, looked like it was going nowhere fast. I drove a 2011 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it because every spare dollar went back into payroll. I wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. I hadn't taken vacation in 2 years. Vanessa used to say she admired my hustle. She said it less and less as the months went on. By the end, she'd stopped saying it altogether and started saying things like, "Don't you think it's time to get a real job, Daniel? Something stable." She said it gently, the way people say cruel things when they want plausible deniability later. She said while scrolling through her friend Priya's engagement photos, a rooftop proposal, a 5-carat ring, a fiancé named Bradley who worked, apparently, in private equity, though nobody could ever quite explain what that meant. I didn't know it then, but Vanessa had already started seeing someone else for 2 months before she left. A man named Chase Whitfield, sales director, leased BMW. The kind of guy who tips 25% in front of people and 10% when no one's watching. She didn't tell me about Chase when she left. She just left a note. I found out about him through a mutual friend 6 weeks later, at a party I probably shouldn't have gone to. Someone mentioned casually that Vanessa seemed really happy with her new guy. I smiled. I said something forgettable. And then I went home and didn't sleep for 2 nights. Not from sadness this time, but from a very specific, very quiet kind of rage. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that starts making lists. Here's the part where I have to ask you something, because I think you already have an opinion forming, and I want to be honest with you about where this is going. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to know you best? Not a stranger. Not someone who never bothered to look closely. Someone who had years of access to who you actually were, your late-night ideas scribbled on napkins, your fear of failing your parents, your stubborn 2 a.m. optimism, and decided deliberately that none of it was worth staying for. That's a specific kind of wound. It doesn't heal like other wounds. It calcifies into something useful if you let it. I let it. The company, the one Marcus and I had been bleeding money into for 2 years, was called Halcyon Freight Systems. It automated dispatch routing for mid-sized trucking companies, which sounds boring until you understand that boring industries move trillions of dollars a year and have almost no decent software running them. 11 months after Vanessa left, we signed our first major client, a regional carrier with 400 trucks. 14 months after that, we signed our second, a company 3 times that size. By month 20, a private equity firm called Ashford Meridian Capital came calling. They didn't want to buy us outright. They wanted to invest $40 million for a 30% stake, with an option to acquire full control in 3 years if certain growth targets were hit. I remember sitting across from their lead partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata Kim, in a conference room with a view of the whole city, thinking about the kitchen counter with the 7-word note still sitting in a box somewhere in my closet. I hadn't thrown it away. I'm not sure why. Maybe some part of me knew I'd need the reminder. We signed the deal. 6 months after that, Halcyon was valued at $190 million, and I still drove the Civic. Here's the thing nobody tells you about sudden money. It doesn't change who you are on the inside as fast as it changes what you're capable of doing on the outside. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't move. I told exactly 4 people about the valuation: Marcus, my sister, my accountant, and Renata Kim's team, who obviously already knew. I wasn't hiding it out of humility. I was hiding it because I was waiting that part 2, the invitation. The dinner that night wasn't supposed to involve Vanessa at all. It was a small industry mixer. Ashford Meridian hosted quarterly dinners for their portfolio company founders. Low-key, exclusive, the kind of event where nobody was a name tag, because everyone in the room already knows who matters. I almost didn't go. I'd had a long week, and small talk with strangers in blazers wasn't exactly my idea of Friday night. Marcus talked me into it. Renata specifically asked if you'd be there, he said. Also, free steak, Daniel. Free steak. I drove the Civic. Because I always drove the Civic. Because some habits are armor, and I wasn't ready to take mine off yet. I didn't know that Chase Whitfield, Vanessa's Chase, private equity Chase, leased BMW Chase, had, in the 18 months since I'd last thought about him, taken a job as a sales director at a mid-sized logistics firm called Corvallis Transit. I didn't know that Corvallis Transit had, 6 weeks earlier, quietly become a subsidiary of Ashford Meridian Capital's portfolio. Well, the company's Renata Kim's fund had scooped up in a distressed asset acquisition, restructured, and was now deciding whether to fully integrate, sell off, or shut down. I didn't know that the decision about Corvallis' future, including whether Chase Whitfield still had a job in 6 months, was going to be made based largely on operational recommendations from Halcyon Software Integration, which Marcus and I had personally been asked to consult on. I didn't know any of that when I pulled into the valet line behind a black BMW and heard a laugh I hadn't heard in 3 years. Oh my God, Daniel, Vanessa looked good. I want to be honest about that, because pretending otherwise would make this story a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't lie about what actually happened, even the parts that don't flatter me. She looked good, and she looked exactly the same, and for about 4 seconds, standing there in the cold with the valet reaching for my keys, I felt the ghost of every feeling I used to have for her flicker through my chest like a pilot light that never fully went out. Then Chase stepped out of the BMW, adjusting his cufflinks, and the pilot light went out completely. Wow! Vanessa said, looking past me at the Civic idling in the valet line, its check engine light glowing faintly on the dash, a light I'd been ignoring for 4 months because fixing it felt like admitting the car mattered. You still drive this? There it was. That laugh. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was casual. The kind of laugh that comes from someone who's already decided you're not a threat, not a possibility, not even a person worth being careful around anymore. 3 years ago, that laugh would have found the exact soft place in my chest and dug in. That night, I just smiled and said, "Some things you get attached to." Chase extended a hand, all confidence in Cologne. Chase Whitfield, Corvallis Transit. "And you are Daniel Reyes." I said. Nothing in his face changed. He had no idea what that name was about to mean to him. Small world. Vanessa said, looping her arm through Chase's, already scanning the entrance for people worth being seen next to. "Daniel and I used to date. Ages ago. Before he found his..." She paused, searching for a word, and landed on one with a small, satisfied smile. "Calling." I didn't correct her. I didn't say anything about Halcyon. I didn't mention Renata Kim, who was, at that exact moment, walking to the front doors of the venue behind us, scanning the valet line for the founder she'd specifically asked to attend. I let Vanessa believe whatever story made her feel most comfortable. Let her believe the Civic was the whole truth. Let her walk into that dinner thinking she already knew exactly who I was and exactly how the night would go. She was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. But not yet. Not for another 2 hours. The venue was one of those restored industrial spaces that cost more design than most people's houses cost to build. Exposed brick, filament bulbs, a ceiling 3 stories up. Ashford Meridian had rented the whole second floor. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of seared scallops. Somewhere, a string quartet was playing something that sounded expensive. Vanessa and Chase walked ahead of me, already performing for the room. She had a talent for that. Walking into a space like she was being filmed, chin slightly lifted, eyes already cataloging who was worth talking to and who wasn't. I hung back near the coat check longer than I needed to, not out of nerves, out of timing. Marcus found me first, weaving through a cluster of investors with 2 glasses of scotch, handed me one without asking. "You look like a man who just saw a ghost," he said. "Worse," I said. "I saw an X." Marcus followed my gaze across the room, to where Vanessa was laughing at something Chase said, her hand resting on his forearm in that proprietary way people touch things they consider theirs. Marcus had never met Vanessa. He joined the company 8 months after she left, but he knew the outline of the story. Everyone close to me did. "That's her," he asked. "That's her. And the guy?" "Sales director, Corvallis Transit." Marcus went very still. He set his scotch down slowly, like it had suddenly become dangerous. "Daniel, Corvallis Transit is the account we're presenting the integration audit on. Tonight, Renata specifically wants us in the room when she announces the restructuring decision." I already knew that. I'd known it for 6 days, ever since Renata's assistant sent over the evening's agenda. I'd read Chase Whitfield's name in a spreadsheet of Corvallis sales leadership 3 days before I ever saw his face again in person. I hadn't told Marcus that part yet. I told him now, quietly, while the string quartet swelled into something with too many violins. Marcus stared at me for a long moment. "You knew," he said. "You knew he'd be here." I knew Corvallis' leadership was invited. I didn't know for certain he'd come. I didn't know Vanessa would be with him. That part was true. The universe hadn't needed my help to make this ironic. It had done that all on its own. All I'd done was not look away from the invitation list when I could have. "So what do we do?" "Exactly what we were going to do," I said. "We present the audit. We tell the truth about the numbers. Nothing about tonight changes what the data says." Marcus studied my face for a beat, the way he'd learned over 3 years of watching me make decisions that looked reckless right up until they weren't. "This isn't about the audit, is it?" "The audit's real," I said. "Everything I'm about to say is going to be completely true." "That's not what I asked." I didn't answer him, because the truth was complicated, and because Renata Kim had just stepped onto a small raised platform near the bar with a microphone in her hand, and the room was starting to quiet. Renata Kim did not waste time on pleasantries. That was one of the things I respected about her most. She treated a room full of successful people like they had better things to do than listen to her flatter them, which, generally, they did. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice carrying easily without the mic even really needing to work for it. "Tonight, before dinner, I want to do something a little unconventional. Ashford Meridian doesn't usually discuss portfolio decisions in a room like this. But I think transparency builds trust, and most of you in this room are going to be affected, directly or indirectly, by what I'm about to say." I felt Vanessa's eyes drift toward me across the room. Not because she suspected anything yet, but out of habit, the automatic scan a person does when a former partner is standing nearby and might, at any moment, embarrass them by existing too visibly. I didn't look away this time. 8 months ago, Renata continued, we acquired Corvallis Transit as part of distressed asset restructuring. Since then, we've been running a full operational and technology audit to determine the company's path forward, whether it gets folded into one of our other logistics holdings, sold, or wound down. Chase's expression, I noticed, had shifted from relaxed to attentive. Somewhere in the last 30 seconds, he'd realized this speech was about him. In a way, people realize a storm is close by the change in air pressure before they see any rain. That audit, Renata said, was conducted primarily using Halcyon Freight Systems dispatch and operations software, a tool built by two of the smartest founders in this industry, who I'm going to ask to say a few words, because frankly, they understand these numbers better than I do. She looked directly at me. Daniel, Marcus, would you join me? I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it matters more than anything that happens in the next 10 minutes. I hadn't planned this specific moment. I want to be honest about that. I hadn't orchestrated Renata's speech, hadn't asked her to call me up, hadn't scripted some grand unveiling designed to humiliate Vanessa in front of a room of investors. What I had done, quietly, patiently, for 2.5 years, was build something real, something true, something that didn't need a single word of exaggeration to be devastating, because the numbers themselves were devastating enough. Revenge, if you do it right, doesn't require you to lie. It just requires you to finally let the truth stand somewhere it can be seen. I set down my scotch. I buttoned my jacket, and I walked toward that small raised platform past Vanessa, close enough that she could see, for the first time all night, that something about the way I was moving had changed. She wasn't laughing anymore. Every betrayal eventually meets a room it can't control. Vanessa was about to find out that this was hers. Renata handed me the microphone, like she was handing me something she trusted completely, which, after 2 years of quarterly reports and 2 a.m. emails, she did. I looked out at the room. Investors, portfolio founders, waiters frozen mid-step near the kitchen doors. Vanessa near the back, her arm no longer looped through Chase's. She'd taken a small step away from him, without seeming to notice she'd done it. The way people instinctively put distance between themselves and something that's about to catch fire. Thank you, Renata, I said. I'll keep this simple, because the data speaks for itself better than I can. I clicked forward to the first slide on the screen behind me, a slide Marcus and I had built 2 weeks earlier, before I had any idea Chase Whitfield's name would mean anything to me personally. Corvallis Transit operates 340 trucks across 6 regional hubs, I said. Over the last 8 months, our software has tracked every dispatch, every delayed load, every missed delivery window, and every dollar preventable cost across the fleet. I let that sentence sit in the room for a second. What we found, I continued, is that Corvallis' core operational problem isn't its trucks, its drivers, or its routes. All 3 of those are, frankly, above average for the industry. The problem is upstream, in sales commitments that operations was never structurally able to fulfill. I clicked to the next slide. A chart, red bars climbing steadily over 8 months. Specifically, I said, we found a pattern of overpromised delivery windows tied almost entirely to accounts closed by a single sales director whose contract routinely committed clients to service levels of dispatch system was mathematically incapable of hitting, inflating short-term sales numbers at the direct expense of long-term client retention and operational cost. I didn't look at Chase when I said it. I didn't have to. I felt the room's attention shift toward him anyway. The way a room full of professionals instinctively locates the person's sentence like that is actually about, even when no name has been said yet. Over 8 months, I continued. This pattern cost Corvallis an estimated $2.3 million in penalty clauses, client churn, and emergency freight costs. Costs that were, until this audit, effectively invisible in the company's standard sales reporting because they showed up in operations, not sales. Renata took the microphone back, her voice calm, final, which is why, effective this quarter, Astra Meridian will be restructuring Corvallis' sales leadership entirely, alongside implementing Halcyon's full dispatching commitment software across all 6 hubs. She didn't say Chase's name. She didn't have to. His face had already gone particular shade of pale that happens when a man realizes, in real time, in front of a room full of people whose opinion of him matters professionally, that his entire competitive advantage, the smooth confidence, the easy charm, the numbers he'd always managed to talk his way around, had just been quietly, mathematically, publicly disassembled. Have you ever watched someone's whole personality stop, working in real time? That's what happened to Chase in the next 90 seconds. I want to slow down here, because this is a part of the story people usually get wrong when they imagine revenge. They imagine shouting. They imagine a dramatic confrontation, a finger pointed across a room, a villain publicly named and humiliated by title. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and worse for him. A woman near the front, one of Astro Meridian's senior partners, a woman named Diane Okafor who did not suffer fools even slightly, turned to a man next to her and asked, not quietly at all, "Wait, is that the sales director from the slide?" Chase's hand, I noticed, had started to tremble slightly around his glass. Not dramatically. Just enough that I recognized it. Because I remembered a version of that same tremble in my own hands, 3 years earlier, standing alone in an empty kitchen. Vanessa was watching him now instead of me, her face doing something complicated. The beginning of a recalculation. Not sympathy exactly. Something closer to cold, fast math of a person realizing the ground underneath a relationship had just shifted, and doing rapid inventory of what that meant for her. I finished the presentation. I answered 2 questions from investors about implementation timelines. I thanked Renata. I stepped down from the platform. And then I did something I hadn't fully planned, though some part of me, the part that had kept that 7-word note in a box in my closet for 3 years, had clearly been rehearsing it without telling the rest of me. I walked over to Vanessa. She saw me coming and didn't move away, which surprised me a little. Maybe she was too stunned. Maybe some old habit made her stay put. Chase had drifted toward the bar, phone already out, texting someone, his own lawyer, I'd guess, or maybe just anyone who might tell him this wasn't as bad as it looked. It was, "You own that company," Vanessa said. Not a question. A fact she was still catching up to. "I co-founded it," I said. "Marcus and I. You met him tonight. Actually, Scotch tall, terrible taste in ties. Your worth." She stopped herself, like saying the number out loud would make something true that she wasn't ready for. "I don't think that's really what tonight was about," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her do something I recognized, because I used to watch her do it during our relationship whenever a situation shifted in a way she hadn't accounted for. She recalibrated. Fast, efficient, almost admirable, if it weren't so transparent. "Daniel," she said, softer now, a version of her voice I hadn't heard in 3 years, one that used to work on me completely. I had no idea. I mean, God, if I'd known. "That's the part one need you to sit with," I said, and I said it gently because I meant it gently, not that you didn't know, that it would have mattered to you if you had. She opened her mouth, closed it. "You didn't leave because I didn't have money," I said. "You left because you couldn't be certain I'd have it eventually, and you weren't willing to bet on the uncertainty. That's not a moral failing. Vanessa, some people need certainty. But don't stand here now and pretend this changes what happened. It doesn't. It just proves I understood you correctly the whole time." "That's not fair," she said, and for a second there was real hurt in her voice, the kind that made me remember, briefly, why I'd loved her in the first place. People are rarely simple villains. That's what makes betrayal complicated instead of just painful. "No," I agreed. "It's not fair. Leaving a 7-word note on a counter wasn't fair either. I'm not here to make this even. I'm just here to make sure you don't get to keep telling yourself the version of the story where I ended up nowhere." I glanced toward the bar, where Chase was still on his phone, his shoulders tight in a way that suggested the call was not going well. "For what it's worth," I said, "I hope it works out for you and Chase. I mean that, but you might want to ask him how secure that BMW lease is looking 6 months from now." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked back toward Marcus and Renata, who were watching the whole exchange with a specific, careful blankness of people who'd witnessed something they weren't going to mention out loud, but would absolutely bring up later, privately, with raised eyebrows. "You good?" Marcus asked quietly. "Better than I've been in 3 years," I said, and I realized, saying it, that it was true. Not because of Vanessa's face in that moment, not because of the number on Halcyon's valuation, but because of something quieter than either of those things. I'd stopped needing her to see me differently. I just needed, for once, to see myself clearly. The money and the audit in the room full of witnesses were just the accidental proof of something I already knew, that the version of me she'd walked away from had been building something real the entire time, whether she believed in it or not. Some people don't need revenge to feel loud or dramatic. Sometimes the truth, spoken plainly in the right room, is louder than anything you could have shouted. I like to tell you the story ends there, at the party, with a clean and cinematic exit line. Real life rarely gives you that kind of tidy ending. So let me tell you what actually happened over the following 6 months, because the aftermath is where the story earns whatever meaning it has. Corvallis Transit Sales Division was restructured within 3 weeks. Chase Whitfield wasn't fired outright. Ashford Meridian, to their credit, wasn't in the business of public cruelty, only accurate accounting. He was offered a lateral move to a smaller regional territory at a significantly reduced base salary, with commission structures that no longer rewarded the kind of overpromising that had built his old numbers. He lasted 11 weeks in the new role before resigning, according to Marcus, who kept a closer eye on the Corvallis integration than I did, mostly, I suspect, because he found the whole situation fascinating in a way I found merely conclusive. I heard, secondhand, that the BMW lease didn't survive the transition either. Vanessa and Chase were still together as of the last thing I heard, though together apparently now involved a much smaller apartment and considerably fewer rooftop proposal-style Instagram posts. I don't say that with satisfaction. Exactly. I say it because it's true, and because this story only works if I tell you the whole truth, including the parts that don't resolve into a perfect moral lesson. Here's the part that actually matters, though. The part one thing about more than the dinner, more than the audit slide, more than Chase's trembling hand around that glass. 2 weeks after that party, I traded in the Civic, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone anymore. I traded it in because the check engine light had finally meant something real, and because I realized, driving into the dealership, that I had been keeping it as a kind of armor for 3 years, a way of staying recognizable to a version of myself that had been hurt, a way of refusing to let the money change who I fundamentally was. But somewhere in that parking lot, watching Vanessa's face do the math on everything she'd underestimated, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. The car had never been the point. It never proved anything about my character, and giving it up didn't prove anything either. What mattered was that I'd built something real during the years everyone assumed I was failing, quietly, without needing anyone's belief to make it true. I still have that note, by the way, the 7-word one. It's not in a box in my closet anymore. I framed it, not out of bitterness, out of respect for what it taught me, that being underestimated by someone who claims to know you isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's just a part right before the chapter where you finally stop explaining yourself to people who already decided not to listen. Some people don't regret betraying you. They regret failing to notice who you were about to become.